Tablature troubles. Why guitar tabs aren't the universal answer. The limits of tab in a digital, modular, and AI-driven musical world. The historical context of the guitar tab. In other words, why tablature was invented. Noting, in a prior presentation, we looked at the pros and cons of the most traditional way to write down and read musical ideas, musical information, songs, melodies, and so forth. That, of course, being sheet music. Now, one of the limitations with sheet music, in particular, if we're looking at a specific instrument like a guitar, is that the sheet music is designed with the musical computer of the day in mind, that being the piano. So obviously the tablature is the most specific way to write down the musical information with the specific instrument of the guitar in mind. That said, however, it still has some limitations that looks like it's still mirroring some of the problems or some of the mental framework that was designed based on, in essence, the piano. So let's take a look at the pros and cons here. It was created as a guitar-specific shortcut. So note, when you hear the term shortcut, that's going to lead you in your mind to think, well, if I was a real musician, I would be using sheet music, but I'm not because I'm just tinkering around and therefore I'm using tablature. Now, there is some truth to that because if you can read the sheet music, you have more context. But we talked about the pros and cons of sheet music as well in the modern day. In other words, the sheet music isn't in essence the answer either. We would like to come up with some type of system to be able to write down the information more efficiently than the sheet music in a universal way, and then possibly create more specific tools for specific instruments like the guitar, which could be designed better than we currently have with the tablature. So in other words, don't feel bad about using tablature. Don't feel like the sheet music is somehow more sophisticated. It is in some senses, but it still has its own kind of problems. So that's just when it would be appropriate to use a particular tool. It's meant to show finger placement rather than abstract notation. So when we're thinking about the tablature, we're really kind of mirroring things. We're trying to show something in the tablature, kind of like someone doing the actual information on like a YouTube so that we can copy their fingering exactly. Now, these days, of course, we have more information like YouTube and videos that can help us with that mirroring kind of information, which might be better techniques than before we had that, in which case we had to actually write down, put your finger here, put your finger there, here's the strings, here's where you put your fingers. So become popular in folk, rock, and modern guitar teaching. So obviously this is in folk and rock, those are going to be the areas that kind of deviated from traditional music, using the guitar more as kind of the computer of the day to be writing songs and play melodies, even though it does not have as much range as the piano. Obviously, these days, if you want the most range to be able to play both hands and whatnot, you might just use a computer. A DAW system, I think, is going to replace some of the musical idea creativity that takes place usually with someone that has a piano because they have the biggest range. But the guitar still has a pretty good range for certain types of music that you're going to be playing with. So works well for showing riffs, licks, and basic shapes. So the core problems with the tablature. Tabs are helpful but incomplete. So the upside down layout for intuitive readers. Now, I'll show this in a second, but notice that when we look at the tablature, if you have something like this on the tab, then the number is going to be representing the fret that we're on, and then we have the strings that we're going to be on. Noting, however, that the strings are kind of upside down. In other words, when I'm behind the guitar playing position, then I have the lowest heavy string on top closest to the ceiling. The highest or thin string is on the bottom. So you would think the most intuitive way to write the tab would be similar, as though we imprinted the guitar on the page. But for some reason, they put the skinny string on top. That means that we have to kind of rearrange it in our mind, flip it around in our mind. Two reasons that might have happened. One, they might have said, well, look, if I look at the guitar and I turn it around to face the guitar, then it has the skinny string on top, or they might be thinking, well, I still like the idea of pitch rising up as it is in sheet music, and therefore that we have the skinny string on top. But it's really not the optimal way to do it if I'm practicing simply mirroring, which is what the tablature is doing. It's simply supposed to be a mirror showing you exactly where you put your fingers. So you might as well, if that's what we're doing, we should write it in as easy a way as possible. That's the point of the tablature, to be as easy as possible. If I'm just trying to mimic something, I want it to be mirrored because that's going to be the easiest way to see it. So hyper specialized for guitar, not transferable. So clearly when you look at the tablature, it only applies to the guitar, whereas a sheet music, in theory, could be read by any musician if they understand how to read, in essence, the sheet music. So it's just a tool specifically for one instrument. Chords are vague and limited. In other words, you still have the chord kind of problem where the strings are forcing us to kind of stack the chords in a way. If you play a triad, has 3 chords, but it's even kind of weirder than stacking because the strings are not evenly spaced all the way through. There's a kink in the tuning and so forth. So you still have this weird visualization of the chords, meaning you have to kind of know the shape, and you need to know the shape kind of upside down because it doesn't really mirror what you would be doing with your fingers because you would have the heavy string on top. So you have to be able to really kind of twist the thing around in your mind, have good spatial reasoning. If you played a lot of video games, you might be quite good at that, but you have to turn things around. Inversion, drop-in notes, complex voicings are hard to show. So in other words, it's hard to show, the chords that are playing, or an inverted chord, which is the lowest note, and so on. Still uses absolute fret numbers, not relative position. So when we're mapping this thing out, we're just saying you're putting your finger here on this string on this fret. So by doing that, then we're locking into a particular note on the guitar in essence. It's not really telling you the note, but you're still on a specific location. Whereas it would be nice if you could show relative position like Nashville number kind of system. Why? Because then you can transpose everything. In other words, if you look at something in sheet music and you're like, it's in the key of C major and I want to push it up to D major or something, you can't really do that very easily. You'd have to rewrite the whole sheet music. You can imagine, in theory, it should be doable in that if you had a digital sheet music that's mapping everything out in relation to one position, you should be able to move the whole thing up, right? Transpose it. That should be a tool that would be available in the modern AI era. So not built for transposition or modular rotation. So if we had Twinkle Twinkle Little Star here, then the problem is that we have the high string on top. So remember, if I'm behind the guitar, I have the skinny string is at the floor, not on the top. The low or heavy string, when I'm behind the guitar closest to the ceiling, is on top. So when I'm playing this, it's kind of like it's inverted, and I have to shift it around in my mind. You get used to that, you can kind of do it. The 3 here is representing the fret. So considering that is the fret, it's a specific location. So if I wanted to shift this entire thing up to a different key, I could kind of see it because I could just say, well, everything would shift up one key or something like that. But it would be kind of nice if we had the ability to automatically shift that information. Notice if I had a chord here, this is a melody. If it was a chord, then you're going to have multiple notes in one row, which is kind of like a form of stacking, but it's going to be a stacking that's specific to the layout of the strings on the guitar. So this is a very simple melody, which is what the tablature kind of works best with, which is basically a kind of a melody rather than complex chord structures. So upside down, so the upside down problem. Why are the tabs written backwards? So you might think, as I often have, many people don't think this, but I mean, it seems to me, why in the world didn't they write the tablature in a mirrored format? Because if I'm trying to learn by just replicating what's there, then you think you would write it in the easiest format because that's the point of the tablature. So in tab, the high E string thin one is on the top. So the low E string thick is on the bottom line. So this is opposite to how the guitar physically sees, feels the instrument. So the heavy strings closer to your face, it's closer to the ceiling. The thin strings are further away. So intuitive, no. Traditional, yes. Historically, this came from aligning tab with standard staff notation. So notice what we did is we said, hey, look, I don't like the standard staff notation, or I'm going to try to deviate from the standard staff notation because it was clearly designed with a piano in mind, and it has these sharps and flats and whatnot, and you have to assign how many sharps and flats because that helps you lay out the positioning on the piano. That's completely useless on any other instrument, including the guitar. Let's create something specific to the guitar. And they did, except they still couldn't resist having the strings inverted because then the pitch goes up, similar to what happens on the staff, even though the pitch going up on a guitar means that you're physically going down towards the floor on the guitar. So again, that to me is, we couldn't get out of the mindset. They tried to break out of the mindset and say, I'm going to make something that's specific for the guitar, but they couldn't quite do it. And the piano-based, centered-based system still messed them up. And then it got locked into place because all the tablature was written that way. It became standard. Now, these days, we don't have to deal with that standard. Why? Because all the tablature can be automatically shifted with simple AI that we already have. A chat thing could basically just flip the tablature. It's one-to-one translation. So we're not locked in the errors that we made in the past simply because we wrote them down in a book, and simply because all past music is written that way is no longer a barrier to us fixing it, because it could all be transposed automatically, easier than shifting or translating from Latin to English, for example. One-to-one translation. So here's the layout of Twinkle Twinkle Little Star. Here it is. It would be nice, notice, to have the words as well and have basically chords that we could be mapping out on this as well.